Okay, I see more and more people are joining us, and so I'm going to start our discussion so we can get going. So welcome everybody to the UCT Chemicals Network discussion. It is great to see you all online and to have you back for another discussion of ours. We are very excited for today's discussion. And so as we just introduce the discussion, please would you introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't done so already. If you've just joined us, please introduce yourself by using or giving us your name, the organization you represent, and the country that you are from. And yeah, continue to do that. For this discussion today, I will explain the introduction first, which is just a bit of a background on what the network is and why it exists, and then I'll talk us through how the discussion will work. From there, I will get our presenters to introduce themselves, and then we will move on to begin the discussion. So just to start off, I would like to introduce myself. I am Maxine Jonker, and I'm the project manager for the Division of Environmental Health in the University of Cape Town School of Public Health. I will be facilitating today's discussion. In the background, we have Eunice Chilengu. She is one of our MPH students and a research assistant in our division, and she is the person who coordinates these discussions, and you've probably been receiving all the emails from Eunice. So just to introduce our team, Eunice is working in the background. She's doing all the technical and administrative support. So if you have any issues in terms of technical issues, you're welcome to join the WhatsApp group that we have, or you can message Eunice privately on Zoom and she will try and assist you. So the purpose of the Chemicals Network discussion is for us to bring representatives from different regions, sectors, and stakeholder groups together to foster a mutually supporting consortium of stakeholders, which will discuss various issues related to chemicals. We aim to particularly build capacity of regulators, researchers, and NGOs in low and middle income countries, and to discuss emerging issues around the sound management of chemicals and waste. We hope to achieve this by learning from each other, sharing information and data, identifying gaps, and problem solve collectively to reduce and prevent chemical poisonings and environmental contamination with a view to a toxic-free future for the next generation. The way that these discussions work is they are not a webinar, but rather a chat discussion. So we will be posting questions for you guys, which you will then discuss in the chat. There will be short presentations before these questions, and we really love to focus on our discussion time and hearing what your thoughts are around the questions that we pose. This is a non-partisan discussion, which means that we respect all viewpoints and we value all inputs. Please, when you are responding to a question or posting a question in the chat, please include your country or your organization in your response so that we know which context you are coming from and how best to answer your question. We also encourage you to please engage with each other's responses in the chat, as well as ask any questions to our presenters that you may have. The way that this discussion will work is we will start off by having a portion of a presentation. This will take a couple of minutes, and then we will post a question in the chat where we will discuss this question for a decent amount of time. Throughout that discussion time, we will be posting polls using Mentimeter, so please feel free to vote on those polls as well, and we'll explain how all of that works. 5 minutes before that question discussion time is over, we will post a warning and you will be able to contribute your final thoughts. From there, we will move on to our next presentation and the next question. And we will do this for a total of 3 questions. So we really encourage you to engage in the topic that we have for today. Today's discussion is WEEE plastics. Whose responsibility are they anyway? And I have the privilege of letting our presenters, Suzanne Karcher and Aisha Lotte, introduce themselves. They will be presenting on this discussion today and are some experts in this field who I'm really excited to have present today. So Suzanne, can I ask you to just briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Suzanne Karcher. I'm actually having a history with UCT because I did my final year thesis at the chemical engineering department. I have a German degree as a chemical engineer, but I did that at UCT in South Africa. And I'm also a coordinator of the WEEE project, which you will learn all about later, but it's concerned with helping to establish better policy, develop an e-waste policy for South Africa, norms and standards, and so on. So that's just me in a nutshell. Otherwise, I'm an environmental consultant, waste minimization, pollution prevention.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Aisha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi. Thanks so much for having me. I am, as you can see, a PhD candidate as part of the WEEE team and a researcher and legal consultant. My thesis is on extended producer responsibility and e-waste. So that's what I'm here to present on. So I'm hoping that we get some really good discussion going. I can see there's lots of people from throughout Africa, which is really fascinating and really exciting. So I look forward to the discussion. My thesis is based in the legal department, so I'm coming from that kind of lens, but my one supervisor is also in the chemical engineering department. That's how me and Suzanne met, actually, was through my supervisor.
Shout out to Jochen Peterson.
Yeah, Jochen is bringing people together. So yeah, I'm studying at UCT and should be submitting this year. The year is going very quickly though, so we shall see. But that is me in a nutshell as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Awesome. So without further ado, I think we can get going with the presentations. So Suzanne, I will hand over to you.
Thank you. Next, please. Right. Just a quick introduction. The WEEE project, what is this all about? It really builds on the success of implementing e-waste recycling systems with developing countries. I hate that term, by the way. And it's happening for more than 15 years. This project is funded by the Swiss State Secretariat of Economic Affairs and is implemented by the Swiss Federal Laboratory for Material Science and Technology. The idea really is not so much to do things for countries, but to create and assist to create favorable framework conditions. That includes also knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer, which actually enables countries to develop their solutions in the e-waste space. And for this round of the WEEE project, we have 4 countries, Ghana, South Africa, Egypt, in 3 of them in Africa, Colombia and Peru on their way out. And all of those countries have benefited from the WEEE program already greatly and continue so. Here in South Africa, Ghana and Egypt, this program will still run until the mid of 25. If you want to find out more, you can always go to the website. There's a whole list of reports that you can download for free as well, which are very interesting. And I will tap into one straight away. Next. So the WEEE project was also active a few years ago in India. And India was a very interesting one because the Indian team was very strong on looking at e-waste plastics. And I actually took the cue from the e-waste plastic work in India to introduce it because we tried through the WEEE project to get people interested in the subject. And I think this is a perfect forum because e-waste plastic bear a lot of potential dangers that are clearly linked to chemicals. So that is the right platform to moan about it. So just to share with you some facts, and that comes straight from this report that you see on the left side called Processing of WEEE Plastics, which is really, really very, very interesting to read. So what you see here in the first figure is really an overall composition of the types of main plastic that are used in electronic equipment. Because when we talk about plastics, we always think about packaging. But, you know, e-waste plastics are also a significant amount. And the types of plastic that you see here are described in this pie chart. And as you can see in the picture next to it, it depends on the equipment. So the percentage contributions can vary quite significantly. But what you can see is that there are some sections called BFR HIPS and BFR ABS, and those are our problem childs because BFR stands for brominated flame retardants, and that is the linkage that I want to create today to our discussions. In principle, in terms of their chemical properties, you can distinguish between thermoplastics and thermosets. Thermoplastics are the ones that soften when you heat them up, and then they harden again when they cool. That's the ones that make it easy to recycle. The ones that are almost impossible are the thermoset. Fortunately, we have the majority thermoplastics in e-waste. We know that plastics, and specifically in e-waste, often contain also additives, some of which are hazardous. And then, as I said, the dreaded brominated flame retardants is just an example of an additive, but you can also have addition of heavy metals such as lead and cadmium. And what is important is when we do the discussion of value add in the value chain of plastic recycling, we need to know where are those hazardous substances and how can we remove them. And this is what this is all about. Next. Right. So as I said, fortunately, most plastics that we find in e-waste plastics or in e-waste can actually be recycled. And what is important is to say that obviously their potential for recycling is at its best when they are pure, when they are actually separated from each other. There are some exceptions with ABS and polycarbonate, but the Samstag rule is keep them separate from each other. So the key is, how do we separate those e-waste plastics, right? And we do know, and that should create also a business case, that 70% of the total mass of e-waste plastics consists of only 4 types of plastics. But we fiddle around with about 15 different types of plastic that we need to distinguish, but 70 of them are actually, the same, which is basically high intensity, high impact polystyrene, ABS, and ABS-PC mix, and polyprop. So what we know is that high levels of BFRs can often be found in plastic housings or screens. This is when they take note, but that we also know that there are equipment where we can almost say we know for sure that any BFRs would be not in there or would be generally below legal limit values. I'll share with you more about this later. And what needs to be known is that we know that about 10% of all the ABS and HIPS plastics that are found in e-waste contain BFRs. So 90% don't. And the others don't even are treated with BFRs. So we should make a case of how do we recycle them and reuse them better. You can see here some fields of applications. What you can do with e-waste plastics, you can use them in agriculture, automotive, construction. The big no-nos are obviously in the food industry. You do not want to have any form of e-waste plastics to become a plastic to be used for food packaging. And also toys, which is sadly a situation where we discover, that some of the cheap toys coming into South Africa are actually laced with heavy metals and flame retardants, and even meant for babies that start chewing on those toys, which is a real crime. Next. And it is actually in principle quite easy. And in an ideal world, we have something called an ISO tag, and there is an ISO standard 11469 that actually says that by law, if anything weighs more than 100 grams as a plastic part, it needs to be marked with a visual identifier. Okay, so in principle, this is a clever thing because you can see in that formula with the first symbol, you can actually see what type of plastic, then GF, what kind of additives, then also does it contain any form of plasticizers, and finally, what kind of flame retardants does it contain? That will also give you the clue. So it sounds great, but the majority or the reality is that a lot of the plastic parts are simply not labeled, which is part of the problem, or also wrongly labeled, which is also something that we often find. What the Indians really did brilliantly, and I need to unpack this with you briefly, is that there is a very simple way to distinguish all those plastics. Not only that, but also to make a distinction of what is actually treated with flame retardants or not, which means you can actually create a situation where you have plastics that you can vouch for that they are not treated and they are pure as well. And I want to share with you this system that was developed by India. And it is actually brilliant because anyone who has a cosmetic salon or a nail studio can actually do e-waste recycling. Let me explain to you. Imagine you have a whole fraction of e-waste plastics. You don't know what it is. Now, what happens in South Africa, and I want to know later from you what you do, but most of the stuff goes to landfill. People don't really touch it in principle, okay? But if you have a batch, you can granulate this plastic. And then there's various tests, and you can see this decision-making tree, and it starts out with the first test, which is a limonene test. Now, limonene is a very cheap chemical you can buy in a pharmacy. It smells like lemon, actually quite pleasant smelling. And that is where you can actually separate the first fraction, which would be HIPS and PS. So if it sticks on your finger, that granule, you know this is actually this kind of either HIPS or polystyrene. Everything else is not sticking. So let's stick with the HIPS and PS fraction. The next thing you do, you apply your hands, and you can see, does it break or does it bend? If it breaks, you know it is polystyrene. And then that is basically a pure fraction that can go out to recycling as long as you have a market. If it is HIPS, as we learned, ABS and HIPS are the candidates where the flame retardants are hiding, okay? There is a simple test that is actually based on doing a density check. You literally need just some salt and some water, and you can actually do a flotation test. And if it sinks, you know that the flame retardants are contained. If it rises, if it floats, there are no flame retardants. It's actually absolutely brilliant. And if you think this is just like done in very bad accuracy, they have actually, if you read the report, the accuracies are comparable to industrial separation type of accuracies, okay? That makes it so brilliant because this is a developing country kind of solution. So moving on, you have now removed the HIPS and PS. Then you do an acetone test. You use acetone again for the nail polish removal. That's why you need acetone. If there is a white deposit, you know it is polycarbonate, and you can recycle that as polycarbonate, as a pure stream. If it is actually sticking, it could be either a mix of polycarbonate and ABS or ABS, so we need to investigate further. If there is no reaction to the acetone, it is either PVC, that's polyvinyl chloride, polypropylene, polyethylene, or anything else. A freshwater test, again, based on density, can sort out the PVC and others and leaves you with the PP and the PE. And with there is a scratch test with your fingernail. If it marks, it is PE. If it doesn't mark, it is PP. So you can see, you can break down in the end PS, HIPS, PC, ABS, PE, and PP, and you can separate them according if they have flame retardants or not. Next. So I hope by now you are as excited as I am about the possibilities and an untapped potential of recycling those plastics. So I'm asking you, in South Africa, according to our survey, it seems that currently the vast majority of all WEEE plastic types are landfill. Very little gets recovered. And this is not the presentation that I sent, by the way. This is not the last question. I don't know if you can see that. But anyway, so I want to find out, are there any initiatives in your country that actually also are there to recycle brominated flame retardant-free plastics? How can we improve on those plastic recycling rates? Because those are low-hanging fruits for, you know, creating a business case. That's me. Question number 1, done and dusted.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Yes, so that is our first question for today. We will post this question in the chat. So please feel free to post your responses to this question. And yeah, we are excited to discuss this and just hear your thoughts on what the initiatives are in your country and how you feel it can be improved. Suzanne will leave her camera and her microphone on just to respond to any of your questions or any of your inputs. So please feel free, if you have any other questions for her related to this, post it in the chat and we will see how we can respond.
Yeah. Yeah, or even to get started with how are e-waste plastics treated in your country? You know, perhaps we need to go a whole step back before we even trying to ask the question if the flame retardant frees are at least recycled. Is anything done with e-waste plastics? Or what are you doing? What do you witness? What happens to e-waste plastics in your country? Okay. Is there anyone? Yes, please, Perrine from Zambia. What are you doing with your plastics? Exported to other countries for recycling or treatment. Do you know any more about this, Ibo? You see, the problem is with the export. South Africa used to export all its plastics very conveniently to China. But since China has now this work policy, and I will actually raise this later with the PIC procedure, which is linked to the Basel Convention, this is not possible anymore. So the moment China has closed its door to South Africa, we see very little alternatives. We know that people are at the moment looking at reusing those WEEE plastics in the mining sector. There's also, attempts to incorporate them into the construction sector. There is apparently a person that is linked to the Chinese market, but can't hear you anymore. Can you still hear me? Can the rest hear me? Okay. Sorry, Ibu, I don't know why you can't hear me. Everyone else seems to be able to still hear me. But I think it's very, very limited what we can actually export. And we need to ask the hard questions of where does it go and what do people do? In fact, it's interesting how information finds you. I'm getting regularly information from the E-Steward, which is one of the standardization programs for recyclers coming from America. And they just uncovered a huge illegal place in Malaysia where e-waste plastics are currently processed, right? But they are actually imported illegally. So you can assume if you find export solutions, you have to ask very hard questions. Is this even legal what you do? Yeah.
Yeah, Suzanne, it's I think it's a big problem with regards to that.
Oh, Denmark. Okay. So I would suspect if they go to Denmark, they would probably get incinerated. That would be then, I suppose, the best available technology. Yeah. And I actually read through it, but I'm not completely knowledgeable, but I do know that the E-Stewards, they do regularly have those negotiations on rectifying the Basel Convention and tightening it up. And e-waste plastics is now really in the spotlight in terms of that all e-waste plastics would then require a PIC procedure because a lot is actually going through the loophole. So unless you cannot prove that your plastics are really pure, and that's why it should be in your interest. If you can prove that your plastics are pure and not containing flame retardants, you should be able to trade them. Otherwise, you can't. Madagascar e-waste plastic goes into the dump. And often, as you call it, a dump site, that are not even sanitary landfills, right? Those are not even landfills that are supposed to specifically take care. Because strictly speaking, if you have flame retardants, you can only dispose this off at a landfill site that is rated hazardous, classified as a hazardous waste accepting site. So a dump site means no liners, which means that chemicals can actually be liberated when they are exposed to the elements. Yeah. Illegally buried or burned. We saw that also in Ghana, the burning parts, because the sad fact is that the flame retardants actually are quite favorable in creating hot temperatures. So they are often used deliberately by people illegally processing e-waste, trying to recover metal out of tires and things like that. They often throw in those flame retardant containing plastics to reach higher temperatures.
Thanks, Suzanne. I'm just going to quickly jump in and just indicate that we have our first poll on the screen. We have one poll question for this question. So the question is, has e-waste been identified as a problem in your country? Please state your country as part of your reply. So to vote on this poll, you can go to menti.com and use the code at the top of the screen, 89061371, or you can vote using the link that has been posted in the chat. Please remember to add your country to your response so that we know where there are issues or where e-waste has been identified as a problem. And for those who might have just joined, not sure what we are doing, at the moment we are discussing question 1 in the chat. So please feel free to continue to answer that question.
Rebecca, in your research, please start looking at Malaysia. They just opened a can of worms that the stuff is now going to Malaysia, not to China anymore, because they are much more strict. But apparently now Malaysia is the new dumping ground. Also, Pakistan, I know, is a dumping ground of e-waste plastics. So have a look at those countries as well. They are also, unfortunately, very strongly linked to abuse with child labor and things like that. And it's wonderful that you actually do something on the presence of BFRs in children, because the BFRs, brominated flame retardants, they contain chemicals that we term persistent organic pollutants. And this is what this group is all about. So POPs accumulate, as we all know, first in the food chain, and then people absorb them as well, and they are staying there forever. Mauritius, yeah, Sanjay. And what we see is, you know, electronic waste, a major problem. Obviously, there are the cherry pickers. Obviously, there are the fractions that have value. And in a free market, they disappear. You don't see them as a waste problem appearing. But the e-waste plastics are a huge issue. Okay, shall we go ahead? I'm not sure what the time's saying.
We still have a few minutes to discuss this question, so we can wrap it up in 2 minutes or so, and then we can move on. If you feel we can move on to the next part of the presentation, we can move on at about half past. So perhaps everyone, if you can post your final thoughts in the chat regarding question 1, as well as your final thoughts for the poll, and then we can move on to the next question in a few minutes.
Yeah, Natasha, absolutely. And, you know, we also, if you are fortunate to live in Cape Town, we have also drop-off sites. And I know in Johannesburg, there are the garden sites. By Pick It Up, they also accept e-waste. There is no distinction there about what kind. You know, they're basically having a third-party arrangement with a service provider, and then that gets collected there. Yeah. And it might be interesting seeing that Paul is in the call, which is our third musketeer in the SHREE project. Paul just released a report on e-waste, an e-waste survey in Ilembe, household e-waste in Ilembe. And that report can also be found on that SHREE website. We literally just uploaded it. So if you do that research, trying to find out how is the situation looking like e-waste in South Africa, how much is it? What do people have? What do they stockpile? This is a brand new report, which is linked to Ilembe, but I think it shows some very applicable national trends as well. A waste management regulation, right? Yeah. Sanjay, I'm quite happy to share with you also our first draft of the South African e-waste policy. It's obviously not yet cast in stone. The idea is that it will be internally reworked by the national government, but we do have an advanced version of an e-waste policy, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We are happy in South Africa to share with the rest of the world and have a look at our proposed approach to our e-waste policy. Thank you, Paul. Glad you can hear me now. Thank you.
Okay, so I see it is past. So perhaps we can move on to our next set of the presentation. So thank you everyone for your engagement on that first question and for engagements on the poll questions. And so Suzanne, I'll hand back over to you for part 2.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So we learned that if we successfully manage to depollute in this very simple format that is really a low-tech, high labor-intense operation, which is what India is favoring, which is what we should favor, we can actually take the SIPs and ABS out, and we can actually distinguish who the BFR, where the BFRs sit and where not. And we know that about 5% of all the plastics averaged over all WEEE types only contain those. And that is really helpful, because if you are already a recycler of e-waste, if you receive anything that resembles a large household appliance, which would be a fridge or a freezer or a stove, or a cooling or freezing appliance, air conditioner, or whatever, you can rest assured that you don't have to worry about any brominated flame retardant treated plastics. The devil is in the detail when it comes to CRT screens, flat screens, IT equipment, and small electronic devices. This is where then you would be, if you receive that as a recycler and you want to actually get involved with recycling that plastics and not just dumping it, landfilling it, you would have to actually take those plastics aside from those types and granulate those plastics to come up with the kind of mix that you have. And as you said, the red ones are the BFRs, the black ones are the ones we don't have to worry. The blue one is for a different reason. That's a chlorinated plastic. PVC is a nasty one too. Not flame retardant, but chlorinated plastic. That's why it's marked in blue. Next. So obviously, we are not the first ones that asked the question. And as I alluded to it, there are international standards and treaties that try to get some control on this thing. And, you know, in the EU regulations, for example, the usage of BFRs is regulated via the Restriction of Hazardous Substances Directive. That's the ROHS Act, which is a European act. And you know, most of what we import here to South Africa needs also be compliant with ROHS. And that has a limit value for heavy metals, as well as for brominated flame retardants, PBBS and PBDEs. Sorry, I'm a chemical engineer, but I can't remember right now what the whole word for that stands, but they're all BFRs. And you can see that there is a limit of 1,000 ppm as a value. The European e-waste treatment standard is higher. That is the Senelec standard, the series from Wielerbeck Senelec standard 50625, and they actually say if you have plastics that exceed 2,000 ppm of total bromine, it is considered to be something that you need to treat as flame retardant treated plastic. There is the transboundary movement of hazardous waste, and e-waste plastics is obviously part of a hazardous waste arrangement. And after the January 21, the experts of mixed plastic fractions require prior informed consent. And that means before you can export such a shipment containing any of those substances, when they are hazardous, you need actually, from the country that receives it, the permission that it grants you to be the country of the destination. And that is really important, because we have seen that, and I'm not proud of it being German myself, that, you know, only 20 years ago, 15 years, even 10 years ago, Africa was regularly used as a dumping ground from the global north. And, you know, the PIC procedure obviously means that you have a say still. It still happens, but at least the idea is that countries cannot just be kind of abused, you know, without even having a consent. Obviously, consent is then given, some money is exchanging hands, and still people are poisoned. So that's also not ideal. Okay. But that is why I also advocate that it would be in so much interest for everyone to create those pure fractions. And I have shown you how easy it is to actually generate those pure fractions. Because if you have those pure fractions and can prove that they don't contain flame retardants, they are not subject to the PIC procedure. And that would make it very attractive to trade. Okay. So if you have the BFRs, on the other hand, we know they are a serious financial liability and a huge challenge to subject to find the best financial treatment. And a serious financial liability means to ask the question, who will pay that bill, right? And Aisha will later share more about EPR, so I'm not going to cross into her turf. But, you know, we need to find out who is actually the original generator of the problem, which is where EPR comes in. So just as a summary on the flame retardants, it's not just brominated flame retardants that exist. There's also phosphorus-based flame retardants and mineral flame retardants, and they are obviously used to prevent e-waste plastics from catching fire when they're exposed to heat. But it is the brominated flame retardants that contain those persistent organic pollutants, and therefore they are very much in the focus, and that is why their use is so restricted by regulatory limits. And that is why they need to be sorted out and appropriately managed. Next slide. And with appropriately managed, I want you to look at the right side, which actually is also from this report. And you can see best practice on the right side and worst practice on the left side, suggested for hazardous plastics, okay? And it's obviously a no-brainer that best available technology incineration is the best thing you can do with flame retardant treated plastics, right? But where in Africa or, you know, in the global south do we have best available technology? We learned that some stuff goes to Denmark. So I'm confident that this is a good solution because Denmark does have incineration of butt. So then the next best thing would be, and that is what we would aim for as a minimum nominator for Africa, that it at least goes to a hazardous landfill site, because there you have restrictions, you have liners, you know, you can encapsulate waste. There are various ways to kind of isolate these types of waste. And you can see there's other stuff they're doing with it. Filler material, recycling, which is then really downcycling, which is super problematic if a recycled flame retardant plastic comes back as a kid's toy, because then it's downcycling, right? Non-bed incineration is really bad as well. So what does that mean? It means like if you have just something that resembles a little oven and call it an incinerator, that's not what we talk about. We need to talk something about technology that contains scrubbers, that has actually the right temperature range to incinerate. You need very high temperatures for those brominated flame retardants to actually be destroyed, okay? So it's not all incinerators are equal. So you need really the cream of the crop of incinerators to deal with these nasty chemicals, okay? Sanitary landfill, that's happening at the moment everywhere. And uncontrolled dumping, obviously this is totally unacceptable. Open burning is the worst. But unfortunately, the status quo is that the overwhelming amount of plastic gets either landfilled, it gets dumped, or illegally burned, irrespective of the composition. So the bed incineration option as preferred is really not happening. So we need to ask now a question. It seems like from your answers, we have the same problem. And what is that question? Please, next. How can our countries, and not just yours, mine too, how can we grow the interest, capacity, and knowledge to recycle the BFR-free plastics, as I showed you? Very simple. How can we get the recyclers interested to do this and not just take the stuff and dump it? But also, how can we then recover the required flame retardant treated ones for final safe treatment? That is super important. So you need to also depollute. Depollution is part of what a recycler needs to do, not just cherry pick, depollution. So please, I want you to start dwelling on this, on how can we achieve both more, getting more interest in recycling the plastics that are not treated, and how and where can we start recovering finances that we find a fund to deal with the final safe treatment of what we need to treat. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. So yes, we are going to discuss this question in the chat. I think it has been posted in the chat already. If not, we will post it in the chat. Yes, it's there. So please feel free to post your responses so we can engage with them. And once again, please, if you have any questions for Suzanne or Aisha, please feel free to post them in the chat and they can address them as they see fit.
Yeah. Definitely also you can ask Aisha. Aisha will present now after me. She will dive deep into the EPR. So you already kind of get an inkling that this is probably about creating a fund that comes from the industry that causes the problem in the first place. But I think also the question that I want you to consider, how do you get your governments interested? How do you get your governments interested in the fact that there is a real problem that the people of your country get polluted with that stuff? How do you interest the governments? How do you create the incentives for the recyclers? And how do you make the producers responsible to pick up the bill? Anyone?
Paul has an interesting comment, and I think that this does lead into potentially my ideas around growing this interest. And it's about finding alternative job creation activities that will then incentivize government to say, oh, well, we can actually make money out of this. It is a gray recyclate. It isn't something that you actually can make a lot of money out of. It's something that we have to manage. But Paul has posted that one of the PROs in South Africa has been looking at this alternative, looking at putting these plastics into bricks. My first gut feeling is I don't want a brick that's filled with this plastic, which might be just out of my own fear for these kinds of products.
Have you never played with Lego, Aisha?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, maybe. Do you think that those plastics are flame retardants unless it's
No, I know there was also, they done that a few years ago. There was a company in South Africa called Resin Tile. They also looked at in an injection molding process, also including flame retardant plastics to make roof tiles. And the argument was also, well, it is an added advantage if you have roof tiles that have been treated with flame retardants. But I think they are not existing anymore.
I just wonder how long it can last, because if we have them in our tiles on top of our roofs, they're exposed to a lot of weather, and that erosion leads to microplastics, which is another whole environmental.
Absolutely. And then you're exposed to stuff, to the element, and those chemicals do not magically disappear. And the ones that are called persistent organic pollutants have a reason for why they're called that. It means you can't kill them.
Persistent.
Persistent. And what was for me really the mind opener, I know this is a bit outside of the subject, but while people are typing, the story of stuff was for me one of those videos that really explained to me what is the core of the problem with the world. And in the story of stuff from Ellie Leonard, she has that statement, toxics in, toxins out. So it makes for me also complete sense as a chemical engineer. It doesn't matter if you look in a process or you look in a product, if you actually design in pollutants, those pollutants will come out in one way or the other. You might be able to transfer that pollutant from a landborne to an airborne or a waterborne, but it still is a pollutant. And I think we spent way too much effort on trying to find elegant solutions to contain or concentrate pollutants. And we don't spend half as much time as to actually ask the hard questions. Why do we produce so much pollutants in the first place?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So some stuff is coming in here. Madagascar, initiative of e-waste and plastic inside treatment are done by private sector. It's not enough. EPR. And Aisha is the queen of EPR. She will tell you all about it now. Mauritius is embracing the concepts. All kind of waste. In fact, recently the minister is promoting initiative. Yeah, I am not a big fan of waste to energy or pyrolysis or whatever you want to call it. I know people always chide me because I use it in the same mouth. I mean, there are even people that try to infiltrate the circular economy ISO standard that is currently developed. Industry lobbyists trying to get, waste to energy solutions part of a circular economy solution. I mean, that is the ultimate greenwashing. But I do agree that there might be such nasty types of waste that we have generated that, at least in the interim, before we redesign our products to not have those nasties in the product, that as an interim solution, I would suggest to look into a best available technology type of technology for incineration. But that means, as I said, scrubbers, that means very high temperatures. We're talking millions of dollars of plants. So what African country can afford that? The only way we can then perhaps consider this is that we say, all right, we need to create economies of scale Perhaps we need to start develop regionalized solutions. So we have one of those incinerator plants in the Northern Africa region, one in the Western Africa region, one in the Southern, and one in the Eastern Africa region. And then we have a regional solution for BFR containing e-waste plastics to burn them. Might be something, but who is picking up that bill? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Is there anyone from Rwanda in this call? Because I visited Rwanda 2 years ago when we had the World Circular Economy Forum, and we did actually a site visit to EnviroServe, which is actually a public-private partnership between a private recycler and the government. And it's actually, from what I've seen, one of the most advanced processing plants for e-waste, that I've seen in Africa or even outside of Africa. And it certainly is a guiding light. I would like to find out what are they doing with BFRs. I know they have a offtake agreement with Dubai. So I presume that this is where the offtake agreement takes in, that those kind of, problematic waste streams can be sent to a country like Dubai, who would have then incineration facilities. So perhaps we need to look into pairing our African countries with overseas countries, perhaps. Aisha, perhaps that needs to be even part of an EPR approach going forward. If you talk about a global EPR, to say, do African or do the global South countries not also need a leg up in being able to get the finances for this type of technologies, or even offtake agreements, So if we don't get the funds to develop this kind of technology, then there should be also an inbuilt right to send that stuff to countries that have the best available technology to treat these things. So that stuff should go to Switzerland, that should go to Denmark, that should go everywhere there.
Ultimately, we do have that kind of, it's not really functioning right now because we still see so much of this hazardous waste ending up here. But in the Basel Convention, it is meant to halter and say, you can't import this stuff if we can't manage it. So there is a legal requirement there, but the issue that we have is that we're importing products, so it doesn't come through as waste, it comes through as products, and we have this weird division in our brains that the product and the waste of that product don't relate to one another. They seem to just appears as waste at some point. And that is the problem, really, from a legal perspective, that distinction and that definition of waste keeping us from really having a life cycle perspective. But we'll see the discussion on EPR. We'll touch on that life cycle, like life cycle assessment perspective, but to actually get it into action is a whole other thing. But we can see that there's a lot of energy in the chat around actually getting regulations in place, like keep on seeing those kinds of hopes and promoting awareness and these kinds of interventions that do require the state
and I hear you, Aisha, and it is actually ridiculous because you buy it as a product and you see it as a resource, and then you're done with it, and for you it becomes useless, and you call it a waste. But
and then you can't export it.
and what we put on our landfills, and what pleases me, I'm part of a work group that develops now this ISO standard. SAPS has just now developed a mirror committee to also develop an ISO standard. And we're changing terminology radically. So there is not the term waste used anymore. We call it non-recoverable resource. So instead of calling something a waste, we call it a non-recoverable resource, because it indicates that it's still a resource. It's just not recovered. So I think we need to change our language radically. And I think also the way governments are structured, they only are interested in it when it becomes waste. But as you say, we don't have in South Africa any government structure that would really look at managing resource consumption from a circular economy perspective. that would start much, much earlier at, you know, why do we consume so much in the first place? How can we develop more sharing of access models rather than personal ownership models? Because that would minimize already the challenge of dealing with all those chemicals tremendously, because you would have just less in circulation, right?
Yeah, it's a deeply cultural thing as well. We see most of the production and consumption practices happening in a very specific region of the world. So kind of unpacking that almost from an anthropological perspective would be fascinating. But yeah, that's...
And you get bombarded, you're not good enough, you're not successful enough, you're not sexy enough if you're not buy the latest model, the latest phone, the latest everything. And it actually pushes people into unnecessary consumption. And I think that is at the heart of the problem with the world here.
Yeah, we've got a term for that: planned and perceived obsolescence. Perceived being the one that steps in with the culture and how we see something as useless at some point.
Yes. And planned very much is to design it into the design, which is an evil thing to do, but it is actually real. And there's actually a very interesting YouTube video, if anyone listens, called The Light Bulb Conspiracy, which talks about the history of planned obsolescence, which started with the light bulb. The original light bulb was unkaputtbar, you couldn't destroy it. And there is apparently still one in America that was developed 120 years ago, and it still works. And there was then a consortium started in Switzerland where engineers were penalized when they didn't manage to bring down the lifespan of a light bulb. And, you know, they had to kind of weaken the filament of the light bulb. The same happened also with nylons. You know, the first nylons that women were wearing, where you couldn't destroy them. So people design things that they break and become waste, involuntarily, intentionally. Yeah. Okay, but we are way out here in these discussions, and sorry, I need to look here. Guyana, very interesting. Suresh Amijan, Deputy Registrar, Pesticides and Toxic Chemical Control Board in Guyana. Thank you for joining us. And isn't it that when we think about POPs, we predominantly think mostly about fertilizer, like pesticides and insecticides and, you know, the stuff that comes straight out of the chemical factories. But yeah, I think, you know, in e-waste, some very nasty chemicals are embedded, or in electronics. And I think we need to create much more awareness about this.
Just to quickly jump in and just say we've got our next poll up on the screen. I see people are responding, so thank you so much for that. For anyone who's just joined, to vote on this poll, you go to menti.com and use the code on the screen, or use the link that we've posted in the chat. Please also remember just to add your country into your response. And if you know more detail about the policies or regulatory framework, feel free to add that in as well, and continue to discuss question 2 in the chat. We've got about 6 more minutes to discuss, so keep going and ask questions while we have Suzanne and Aisha here and giving us their time. Feel free to pick their brains as much as you can.
I must say I'm very excited about this forum, because I can see now with my own eyes how diverse it is and how many countries are represented. This is really invaluable. We might come back to you for another session. Because this is a brilliant forum to discuss also, you know, between countries, this type of critical issues. And there's more linked to e-waste than just that. Yeah.
I think the thing that I wanted to mention was that a lot of our challenges in South Africa will be challenges that present themselves in these various jurisdictions.
Yeah.
One of which is that we are trying to control a product that is not designed or manufactured necessarily in our jurisdiction. So how do we, as regulators, as the state, ensure that the products that we import are managed in an efficient way, but also what are we importing? How do we control that point? And how do we incentivize external markets to design better products for us? We are seeing big, regional developments with our, free trade agreements, and hopefully that binds us together and gives us a bit more of a kind of negotiating foot or a stronghold. But the EU is a really good example of how massive that market and powerful that market can be. By changing regulation within the EU, it has such a huge ripple effect on all manufacturing practices. But I would say that we have the capacity then to internalize our manufacturing processes, and that is kind of the link with EPR that I would like to see happen. But let me not jump the gun. Let's stick with it.
No, but would you also say that EPR should also finance creating awareness on the possibilities of e-waste plastic recycling? I think it should, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it, it has that capacity in terms of the regulations and what it requires from us. I think that some will say that the regulations are far too expansive, which is not incorrect, but it does mean that because of its expansive nature, we can incorporate these more novel interventions, which is what you want. Ultimately, you want the industry to have that kind of direction and due north point, but also they can be innovative and figure out their own strategies.
Okay, I think we have exhausted that question now. Shall we move on? And Aisha, I think you take over the rest. So I'll switch myself off. Thank you for your interest.
Perfect. Aisha, you can go for it. Eunice, if you can go to the next slide, we'll head into the background of question 3.
Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, I think if you're just joining, I'm Aisha Lott. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town, which is where the Environmental Health Division is housed as well. I am working on extended producer responsibility, or EPR. It's likely I'm going to use EPR throughout this presentation, so that is what I am talking about when I say that acronym. We in South Africa have developed mandatory EPR, and what that means is that we've promulgated our regulations, and now it is a legal requirement that we have extended producer responsibility schemes that incorporate producers and producer responsibility organizations and PR or PROs. So if I say a PRO, it's the producer organization, some sort of industry-led association that is in control of an EPR scheme. And if I say EPR, you know what I'm talking about now. So in 2020, we got these EPR regulations. I was just in the throes of my master's, and then I realized I had to start basically rewriting everything because out came this legal change. But I just want to give you a sense of where this law sits. First of all, we have our constitution, the Constitution for the Republic of South Africa, and that is really the guiding document. It's a very revolutionary and innovative document, and we have this right to an environment that is not harmful to one's health or well-being. This right is attributable directly to people, so not necessarily to the environment, for the environment to be as healthy as it possibly can be, but it's more that humans within that environment. I think that's an important connection to make. We then have the National Environmental Management Act. That is the principal act that houses a fair amount of other specific acts that deal with different issues, one of which is the Waste Act, so the National Environmental Management Waste Act. We have other ones, the Biodiversity Act, the Water Act. All of these are considered specific environmental management acts. So when we speak about EPR, we are really seeing a lot of its defining characters flow from the Constitution through the National Environmental Management Act, or NEMA, and then NEMWA, which is the National Environmental Management Waste Act. Within that act, we have Section 18 that clarifies and defines what EPR is to South Africa. And for us, it is financial and physical responsibility of a product throughout its life cycle, And this includes waste minimization programs, financial arrangements for the reduction, reuse, recycling, and recovery of waste, as well as awareness programs for public interest. So that really is the definition that we have decided to follow, and it has to be read alongside NEMA and our Constitution. Lastly, then we have this discretionary power, which our minister has now used to enact the waste regulations on EPR. So we have a EPR regulation that then houses, and I know I'm just spiraling down here, but it is very important to know the flow of legislative power and therefore the flow of interpretation, because if any of these regulations are challenged, you need to go through the whole process. First, you step and look at the Waste Act, then you look at NEMA, and then you go to the Constitution. It's kind of a principle of subsidiarity if we want to talk about it a bit more, but that is just a sense of how do we work with these regulations. So coming to the regulations, next slide, please. The two main questions, or rather, we're going to go through three main questions. Who is responsible according to these regulations? What are they responsible for? And lastly, and the last slide, really the kind of big ticket item is, where is the money coming from? How are we dealing with this waste? So when it comes to who is falling within the scope of these of the EPR regulations, it's producers and producer responsibility organizations. Producers are well, specifically juristic or natural persons, mostly juristic, which include brand owners who engage in commercial manufacturing, conversion, refurbishment, or import of new and used identified products. When they speak about identified products, at least today, we're speaking specifically about electronics and electrical equipment. But there are other identified products, and they're coming forward more and more each day with different notices that speak to different products. So at the same time as the electrical and electronic equipment notice, we also had a lighting notice and a single-use plastics and packaging notice. And all of them have their own specific requirements and different definitions of who falls into what. But overarchingly, we have the EPR regulations that are the main kind of checkpoint. So that's what they mean by identified products as identified by the minister. When we look at the PROs, this is a not-for-profit organization that is organized by producers or any person operating in the industrial sector. So these PROs have existed in the past during a more voluntary system, but now that we have the mandatory system, we see these PROs being required, or producers are required to set up EPR schemes. So what is an EPR scheme? An EPR scheme really dives into the next question is, what are we talking about? What are we responsible for? This falls within this EPR scheme that needs to include the entire value chain. How they define those value chains is a different thing. I mean, I'm a bit of an expansionist, I guess. When it comes to the value chain, I tend to include primary mining, but that's not necessarily what you'll see. And so it's a definitional or an interpretation activity there. We have life cycle assessments are also part of this EPR scheme, and empowerment transformation charters, which really try and bolster a broad-based Black economic empowerment. So that kind of gives you a sense of the social component of EPR. And then we also have mandatory takebacks and environmental labels. All of these do kind of align with what we see in NEMWA and NEMA. For the PROs, we see this need to develop a whole system to collect the fees, to comply with different audits, to maintain a register, to ensure collection and recycling and recovering records are taken, and then make sure that that documentation is handed over to SAWIS, which is the South African Waste Information System. They also need to then manage service providers and integrate and compensate the informal sector, as well as promote small businesses, establish infrastructure, and establish secondary markets for the recycled content. This is a massive mandate for PROs and producers, and I do think that it is a good first step. We do need to make sure that how we go about implementing these requirements is feasible. But I think that this gives you a good sense of the breadth of EPR and how important it is to actually manage and understand the system from a regulatory perspective, but also from an economic and social perspective, because we are talking about a very informal sector in most of our jurisdictions. In South Africa, we particularly see the informal sector, and often they're very peripherized. So integrating and compensating is the key kind of place of tension we see with e-waste because of its hazardous nature and its challenge. So with the SHREE project, we are looking at co-working facilities, trying to figure out new ways of doing that. And yeah, I think there's a lot of promise there. So let's go to the next slide. Let's deal with money. And basically what happens here is that a methodology is created by individual PROs and producers that are guided by certain requirements within the EPR regulations. And then we have this fee that has been established. You can see a list here of considerations, and that they have to take into consideration. So that must over there must pay to fund EPR, and must be based on the net cost recovery, including the differentiated rate per item. All of that basically says that this is non-negotiable. We really do have to use the following requirements: the weight of the product, ease of recyclability, the current demand. So that links back to creating a secondary market. So there's this give and take there where you have to establish a fee to create and to base that fee on the demand of your material, but you also have to make that demand exist. And then the cost of establishing a collection system for these identified products, collection, transport, storage, and treatment costs of separately collected waste, administrative costs, costs of public communication and awareness raising. I've seen a lot of comments from the chat, a lot of people saying capacity, knowledge, and general awareness being one of the main phrases. So that's where that comes in. And the costs of the appropriate surveillance of the system, auditing and the rest, and then less the revenue of the recycled material sales. With e-waste, it's a bit of a challenge, and I've seen some comments about the macro initiative, and we can unpack that a little bit further. But ultimately, e-waste is, there's a problem and a promise with it. The problem being that it is hazardous, it's very complicated, and it's difficult to recycle, difficult to manage, and difficult to collect. The promise is that it does contain really fascinating precious metals. It does have this ability to be reused. And when we see this narrative of the circular economy, the first thing we need to think of is reduce, reuse, recycle. And recycle is the last point. So a lot of what you see here is focusing in on recycling, the last point of intervention. Whereas we should be looking, and that's what me and Suzanne were kind of speaking about earlier, at the reduction in interventions and the reuse interventions, because that's where we see the least interventions occurring, but the most necessary interventions. So I think, let me just quickly make a note on this weight of the product and the ease of recyclability. Using those 2 points to define your fee can be a challenge in and of itself. One, because with a lot of electrical equipment, so your washing machines, your fridges, they can be repaired. Oh, sorry. So it's A and B. I'm talking about them kind of in tandem. Ease of recyclability and weight of product. Electronics, they tend to be quite light and they're small. Electrical equipment, they're massive and they're reused quite a lot. You tend to get your washing machine repaired before you dump it on a landfill. If you do that, some people will just put it outside. So these kinds of things don't necessarily help with allocating fees that incentivize the producer to design better products. The whole purpose of EPR sometimes gets lost in all of this regulation and all of this chat. But ultimately, we want to make sure that the producer is responsible for the full life cycle of the product. And why do we want that responsibility? We want that producer to be incentivized, ultimately, to make better products. We don't want it to be the case that the more you make, the more we consume, the more money you make. You know, there can't really be that connection, which is a very big, overwhelming issue that we have, because that's not how our system works. If we consume more, we make more money, and we have this externalization of costs on the environment and the people that need to be protected the most, the informal sector. So I could probably go through each one of these and problematize some of them, but I think just sitting with A and B is enough for now. I'm seeing a lot of comments and I haven't been able to read them at the same time as presenting, but I think that that's what the next step is really. So let's go to the next slide and present the question to you. So how will your country finance treatment solutions for problematic WEEE materials? So that's waste electrical and electronic equipment, as you probably already know by now, such as flame retardant treated plastics. So for me here, the real issue is that we're dealing with something that can't necessarily be, as we see, downcycled. It's not safe. So how do we create this economy around something that is ultimately of negative value? And how do we align that with EPR, which is ultimately what EPR should be doing, is plugging in that gap and saying, okay, well, we can't have this end up damaging the environment, creating social issues, having children play with these toys that are toxic for them. We can't have that happen. And those that are profiting off of what is happening currently need to pay. That's really the EPR hope. So let's see what is happening in the chat so that I don't run away with my own thoughts here. Yes, again, this awareness training, awareness and training, that is really a key component that we need to take into consideration. And developing infrastructure and systems, I mean, that's massive. And ultimately, we're hoping that government steps in and takes over those kinds of processes. It is often their constitutional responsibility, but the capacity to do that is a whole other issue. Sorry, Maxine, I saw you joined. Do you want to step in? You're good.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to let everyone know that they can start answering question 3 in the chat. We have 2 poll questions for this question, so we will post the first one shortly. But yeah, continue to discuss this question, and Aisha will answer as she sees fit.
Okay, yeah. So just saying that infrastructure and systems for e-waste management, we can say that, you know, our EPR regulations are requiring those systems to be set up by producers or PROs. But when it comes to the constitutional responsibility, that's often on the state. Waste management is a state issue. So finding the collaboration, which is often what needs to happen, finding partnerships, setting up contracts, that, you know, moves into a bit more of a liminal space between the public and the private, which is definitely what we're seeing, this kind of quasi-public relationship where there is obligation on private citizens that might be seen more as a public responsibility. And when I speak about public, I'm talking about the state. And when I speak about private, I'm speaking about individuals as well as companies. Okay, so providing incentives for, I'm stuck on this one comment because I should actually move on, sorry. But ultimately the incentive is to not get charged with a lot of fees, which sounds a bit like a disincentive, but we shall see how it is implemented. Okay, the regional e-waste strategy, yes. I think it's a really good point. And I think it's necessary to have those strategies in place, more regional blocks, create that economies of scale that we do need. I think that the most important point there for me is we are only as strong as our weakest jurisdiction. So what I mean by that is if we create these blocks, we know that waste will flow within that block, and then the weakest jurisdiction that doesn't have the capacity will end up with most of that waste just by economic, environmental economic flows. That's the theory, at least, and I think it's seen in practice more than not, is that weaker link, like Malaysia, who doesn't have the legislative power and prowess of China, they end up with these plastics. So it's just something to be aware of, is when we're dealing with these regional blocks, we want to protect everyone. So it needs to be a cooperative agreement. Are all the PROs in South Africa not for profit organizations? Yes, they are. Well, they have to be, according to these regulations. One thing that I need unpacking regarding producers in relation to their responsibility under EPR is the issue of online markets that open doors to independent individuals to import products to South Africa, as in other countries. People buy a lot of electronics from Alibaba, for example. Sounds like enforcement will work easily with big retailers. How do we overcome this? At the point of import, that is really where it sits. You know, we're getting these, and that's why EPR extends to the importers. It's because that they then fall underneath that definition of producer. I think that how we overcome this, again, it's about implementation of the EPR process. We do luckily have that. The importers are included in the definition. But yeah, I think that actually you raise a really good point about these more illicit flows that we won't be able to control, but online markets and individual independent manufacturers that are not in South Africa are going to have to abide by the EPR regulations, which is a good thing. I think that the issue for refurbishment is something that links to this. It's when these individual producers or manufacturers are based in South Africa and they are small. We don't have a very big manufacturing and electrical equipment industry. But at this point, if we are refurbishing, we are creating a second life for these electronics. But we are also putting these refurbishers into the definition of producers. So we're expecting them to pay a fee for doing something that we want them to continue doing. And I think that is a main concern. So it's not necessarily linked to the online issue, but it is speaking about individuals and independent smaller producers that we do actually want to see flourish. The likely possible way would be to get finances from industry players. Yeah, that's where EPR sits. It's really about creating that fee that comes from the most powerful player on the field, which is the person that has the control over the product's design and who is making the most profit out of it. So, you know, we have this massive term producer, but a lot of different people fall underneath that category. So allocating the right fee to the right individual producer, to the right collective, is very, very important. And I think that that is one of the biggest stumbling blocks of EPR that we're going to see, is who needs to pay and how much. Okay, so Lesotho can finance treatment solutions for problematic waste. Yeah, well, I mean, these are really great opportunities to ensure, and I think you made a similar comment earlier around the various routes that we can take, having these budget allocations that are clearly ring-fenced. I think EPR fees need to be ring-fenced as well, but it's not really that is dependent on your jurisdiction. Public-private partnerships as well, very important, very difficult in South Africa from a legal perspective, very like cumbersome administratively, but very important still to have. International aid and grants, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about massive movements in the climate justice area, and refrigerants are huge greenhouse gas emitters. Don't know if that's the right phrase for it, but ultimately, in terms of aid, yes, we need to get these international bodies involved as well when it comes to managing these refrigerants and other e-waste plastics that could potentially be incinerated informally. Financial resources will split. Yeah, hopefully that is the last point. And if I missed anyone's comment and didn't address anything, please do just repost it at the bottom there. Otherwise, I think I've answered most of the questions. If I haven't, pop them into the question again, into the chat, and I'll get to them. Thanks.
Thanks, Aisha. So we had our first poll up before this, which was, who do you think is financially responsible for EPR initiative in your country? And I saw many responses saying industry, some saying government, some saying a combination of industry and government, or manufacturers. And so, yeah, I don't know if you had any comments about that. And then we'll just pop the next poll up again as well.
Yeah, so financially responsible, that is a charged comment. I mean, we can look at industry as a monolith and government as a monolith, but both have very specific different components to each of them. We have local government, municipalities, who are currently incredibly strained and under-resourced, zero capacity to manage a massive incinerator. They're not going to be able to set that up for their province. So it doesn't make sense at that level. It's important to kind of gauge the spectrum of responsibility there. And the same in industry. As I mentioned, we want to encourage refurbishers who are smaller operators to do more manufacturing, to grow. Whereas we've got big characters on the playing field as well, and they are the ones doing most of the harm. So when it looks at the financial responsibility, it is a spectrum on this public and private big divide that we have. I would say that the divide shouldn't really come into play, and it is definitely a shared spectrum, and that we do need to, from an individual perspective as well, take a fair amount of kind of responsibility, and that's where the physical responsibility comes into play. We struggle with collection. People hoard their electronics. They feel that there is some sort of inherent value. We had a recent initiative in South Africa where Macro, a massive retailer in South Africa, looked to people to bring their e-waste and get these vouchers, Macro vouchers. And there was an overwhelming response. Massive amounts of people came out because everybody seems to have a lot of the stuff at home. Everybody has that drawer where there's just a bunch of cables that are like from the early 2000s that you don't really want to throw away because you feel there is this inherent value. And they're not entirely wrong. You have copper, you have potential there, but not for you as an individual necessarily. It's an economies of scale issue, which we've spoken about briefly. Having said that, we often have this division where it's the public and the private. the company and the government. And not to say that they are not the key responsible agents, but once you start unpacking who is actually in that category, you start seeing the various different interests that kind of spiral out of control, and you have to try and make sure that you allocate that responsibility effectively. But you also try and recognize that we are actually dealing with individuals. Often it's like individuals within a system that's very complicated and difficult to manage, and there's a separate governance structure for corporate, separate governance structure for government that you have to navigate in order to make sure that something actually gets done about this issue. So it gets very complicated very quickly. But that's why we love it, and that's why I'm very excited about my thesis. It's like just untangling the web of responsibility that's required. I'm not seeing any other comments, so I think I'll just stop waffling for now.
Amazing. So we've got the last poll up. If anyone would like to submit a final response to the poll, I think we're going to start wrapping up our discussions for today. I know we can go on for a very long time about all these topics, and it's always really good to see everyone's contributions. So Aisha, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think maybe for the group here, we are importing products, but we are not allowing ourselves to export waste. And what I mean by that is that recyclers are struggling to manage these hazardous fractions. These plastics, we're not able to transfer them to jurisdictions that can manage them, like Denmark. I see some, that's the example that we have, but perhaps looking at our exporting of these products to responsible jurisdictions that have the capacity is something that we will have to consider very closely. And if we're looking at regional blocks, we need to strengthen the weakest link. Otherwise, we're going to have a very unethical system. And that ethic comes from sharing the responsibility and not saying that it's not our problem, because it is a global problem. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to Suzanne and Aisha for your expertise today. It's been really good to have you guys on this discussion with us. And I'm sure there can be follow-ups to this. And it's becoming a very big topic of discussion, I think, particularly in the chemicals world, especially EPR at the moment. So looking forward to picking up maybe a further follow-on from this next year in our discussions. So yeah, we just want to say a big thank you from our team. Firstly, just a big thank you again to our presenters for the fact that they've given their time to preparing for this discussion, meeting up with us to figure out what it's going to look like, and then presenting for us today. We appreciate that. Thank you to all of you for attending today, all of our participants. We appreciate you also attending our discussions and contributing to the chat and engaging with our presenters and with the responses in the chat. It's always good to hear your thoughts and to see what's going on in your context as well. Thanks to Eunice in the background for all the hard work that she's done in putting this discussion together, and for just making sure that today has been a success. We do have some evaluation polls that will come up in Zoom. Please, could you consider answering those questions? We appreciate all the feedback that we can get from all of you. If you have not registered to be a part of our network, please do so. The link has been posted in the chat. And so please sign up. You will then know about all of our future discussions that take place, as well as receive our CN Chemicals Network newsletter and a summary digest of this discussion. The digest and the PowerPoint will be accessed through a link in the chat, but also will be sent around after this discussion to everyone who has attended today. We have a tentative date for our next discussion on the 28th of November. So please, will you sign up and register for that if you would like to attend. We are confirming the topic and the details will be sent out soon. But for now, the discussion will potentially be on the 28th of November. thank you so much to everybody for joining. And we hope to see you at our next discussion, and looking forward to engaging further on this topic with everybody. Great.
Bye.
Have a great day,
Thanks.
everybody.
And
Bye.
yeah, I think you can reach us